The world of St. Jude's Elementary was not constructed of mere bricks and mortar. For 7-year-old Claire, it was a labyrinth woven from whispers and the suffocating weight of judgmental silences. The hallways possessed a permanent, haunting aroma, a sharp, clinical sting of industrial floor wax mingled with the damp, earthy scent of wet wool coats hanging in wooden lockers. To Claire, this scent was the smell of anxiety itself, a fragrance that made her lungs feel tight and her throat go dry before she even stepped inside her classroom. Claire did not walk through those corridors. She glided like a ghost attempting to outrun its own shadow. Her shoes were perpetually scuffed at the toes, a physical testament to the hours she spent staring at the linoleum floor, memorizing the patterns of the tiles so she wouldn't have to meet the gaze of a passing stranger. Every footfall felt like an intrusion, a soft thud-thud that seemed to offend the very air around her. Inside classroom 3B, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken rules. Mrs. Gable, the homeroom teacher, was a woman carved from ice and iron. She wore her gray hair in a bun so tight it seemed to pull the corners of her eyes upward, giving her a look of permanent suspicion. Mrs. Gable didn't just value order, she worshipped it, and to her, Claire was a smudge on a clean window, a broken gear in a machine that was supposed to run without friction. Claire, Mrs. Gable's voice would suddenly slice through the rhythmic scratching of 30 pencils, sharp as a paper cut. Is there a particular reason you are studying the dust motes dancing in the sunlight rather than the long division on the blackboard? Or perhaps you've decided that the laws of mathematics simply do not apply to someone of your unique disposition. The class would erupt instantly, a synchronized cruel ripple of snickers and stifled giggles. It wasn't just Sarah, the golden-haired girl with the expensive ribbons, or the boys in the back. It was the collective realization of 30 children that their leader, the adult in the room, had officially declared Claire a target. Claire would feel the heat rise from the base of her neck, a stinging, prickly crimson that stained her cheeks. She would grip her yellow number 2 pencil so hard that the wood groaned, her knuckles turning the color of bleached bone, but she never, not once, looked up. The cruelty of the children was expected, but the betrayal of the adults was the wound that wouldn't heal. In the loud, echoing chaos of the cafeteria, when a boy named Julian would accidentally extend a foot, sending Claire's tray clattering across the floor, the world would stop for a heartbeat. The sound of plastic trays hitting the ground sounded like a gunshot to Claire. As she knelt in a puddle of lukewarm gravy and spilled milk, her eyes stinging with unshed tears, the duty teacher, Mr. Henderson, would merely click his tongue in annoyance. "Watch your step, Claire," he would say, his voice flat, never looking away from his clipboard. "And do try to be more careful. Clean that up immediately. It's a tripping hazard." The unfairness was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She was invisible when she was being hurt, yet she was an eyesore when she was the victim. The educators at St. Jude's didn't see her quietness as a sanctuary or a sign of an imaginative mind. They saw it as a deficiency, a stubborn refusal to be normal. By the time the final bell rang, a harsh, vibrating clang that signaled a temporary truce, Claire was a hollow shell, filled to the brim with the day's accumulated toxins. She would walk the 3 blocks home, her backpack feeling like it was filled with lead weights instead of notebooks. As soon as she crossed the threshold of her bedroom, the only place on earth where the oxygen felt pure, she would perform the ritual. She would sit cross-legged on the floor, pull a single scrap of paper from her bag, and write. She didn't write poetry or fairy tales yet. She wrote the inventory of pain. Mrs. Gable called me a ghost. Julian tripped me in front of everyone. The milk smelled like sour pennies. I want to disappear. She would pour every drop of shame, every flicker of rage, and every cold shiver of loneliness into that ink. Then came the salvation. She would seize the paper with both hands, her heart racing, and rip. Scrrich, the sound was a symphony. She would tear the paper into jagged, tiny snowflakes until the words were no longer words, they were just meaningless white scraps. As she watched them flutter into her wastebasket like falling ash, she felt a profound, fleeting lightness. If she could destroy the paper, she could survive the day. If the words could be unmade, then she wasn't as broken as they told her she was. The transition from the cold, clinical hallways of St. Jude's to the warmth of the house on Elm Street was like stepping from a monochrome photograph into a vibrant, oil-painted world. As Claire pushed open the heavy oak front door, the bell attached to the frame gave a soft, familiar chime, a sound that to her meant the battlefield had officially ceased to exist. The air inside her home didn't smell like floor wax or sour milk. It smelled of cinnamon, old leather, and the faint, sweet scent of her mother's jasmine tea. This was her sanctuary, a fortress built not of stone, but of unwavering belief. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman of soft edges and steel-like resolve. She was usually found in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour or stained with the juice of crushed berries. Alina didn't need to ask how Claire's day was. She could read the St. Jude's shadow on her daughter's face from a mile away. She saw the way Claire's shoulders were hunched toward her ears, as if trying to shield her neck from invisible blows. She saw the redness in Claire's eyes, not from crying, but from the strain of holding the tears back for 7 hours straight. "Leave the heavy bag at the door, my love," Alina would say, her voice a warm blanket that muffled the echoes of Mrs. Gable's sharp tongue. "The world outside is heavy, but here you are light." She would hand Claire a mug of cocoa, the heat seeping through the ceramic and thawing Claire's frozen fingers. Alina never pressured her to speak. She knew that for Claire, words were precious gems that had to be polished in private before they could be shared. Then there was her father, Edward. He was a tall man with spectacles that always sat slightly crooked on his nose and a heart that was a library of untold stories. He spent his days as a restorer of antique books, and he brought that same delicate care to his daughter's spirit. While the rest of the world saw Claire's silence as a void, Edward saw it as a canvas. In the evenings, they would retreat to his study, a room overflowing with towers of books that smelled like ancient secrets. "They tried to dim your light again today, didn't they?" Edward would ask softly, not looking up from the spine of a 19th-century manuscript he was stitching back together. Claire would nod, her voice finally finding its way out of the back of her throat. "Mrs. Gable said I was a ghost. She said I don't belong in the classroom." Edward stopped his work and looked at her, his eyes magnified and kind behind his lenses. "Do you know why they call you a ghost, Claire? Because you see things they're too blind to notice. You see the way the shadows move, the way people's hearts break in silence, the way the wind tells stories to the trees. They are afraid of what they cannot understand. But ghosts, my darling, are the only ones who can walk through walls." Edward would then reach into his desk drawer and pull out something special, not the scraps of paper Claire was used to tearing up, but a leather-bound journal with creamy, thick pages. "The world wants you to tear yourself apart, Claire, but I want you to build. Instead of ripping the day away, I want you to write a different ending. If Julian trips you, write a story where you learn to fly. If Mrs. Gable is cruel, write a play where she is a lonely queen who forgot how to laugh. You have a gift, Claire. You aren't just a girl. You are a creator of worlds. And one day, the world you build will be so big that their small, mean voices won't even be a whisper in the distance." That night, for the first time, Claire didn't rip the paper. She sat under her covers with a flashlight, her pen moving across the cream-colored pages. She wasn't just recording her pain anymore, she was transforming it. She was beginning to realize that while they could control her body in the classroom, her mind was a kingdom they could never invade. By the time Claire reached 12, the battlefield had shifted. It was no longer about tripped feet in the cafeteria or stolen notebooks. The bullying had evolved into something more surgical, more psychological. At Westwood Middle School, the air was sharper, colder. The insults weren't shouted anymore. They were whispered in the back of the bus, typed on early social media pages, and hidden behind invitations to parties that didn't exist. Claire was now a girl of sharp angles and hidden depths. She had grown tall and lean, her hair a curtain she used to hide her face whenever she felt the predatory eyes of her peers. The bullying had moved from the physical world to the digital one. She remembered the first time she saw a hate page dedicated to her. It was titled "The Westwood Freak, Claire's Daily Silence." She sat in the dim light of her bedroom, the blue glow of the computer screen reflecting in her wide, stinging eyes. The comments were a barrage of arrows. Why does she even breathe? Does she even have a voice, or is she just a mannequin? I bet she's writing her suicide note in that stupid leather book. The cruelty was no longer limited to the hours between 8:00 a.m. and 3:00 p.m. It followed her home, it sat in her pocket, it vibrated on her desk. The sanctuary of her bedroom was being breached by invisible monsters. Even the educators had leveled up in their disdain. Her English teacher, Mr. Sterling, was a man who prided himself on literary genius, but he had no patience for Claire's quiet brilliance. When she turned in an essay that was too poetic, too raw, he didn't praise her, he accused her. "Claire," he said, holding her paper between two fingers as if it were a soiled tissue, "this level of vocabulary is suspicious for someone who barely passes her oral exams. Did your father write this for you, or did you find it in one of those dusty books he collects?" The humiliation was a different kind of burn. It wasn't the heat of a blush, it was the frostbite of being told your soul was a forgery. Claire didn't defend herself, she couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat like jagged glass. She just took the paper marked with a red C for lax originality and walked back to her desk while Sarah and her group, now a sophisticated clique of mean-spirited girls, smirked from the front row. That afternoon, Claire didn't go straight home. She walked to the old stone bridge near the edge of town, the place where the river moved fast and the trees offered a canopy of indifference. She pulled out the leather-bound journal her father had given her years ago. It was nearly full now, a thick volume of her life's secret history. She wrote with a feverish intensity. She didn't write about Sarah's smirk or Mr. Sterling's accusations. She wrote a scene, a script. She imagined a world where words were physical weapons. In her story, the girl who didn't speak was the one who held all the power because every word she eventually uttered became a thunderbolt. Scene start INT. The Court of Lies night. The Queen, gable-like, sits on a throne of glass. She points a trembling finger at the silent girl. Queen, why do you not scream? Silent girl, because I am not the one who is afraid. I am the one who is listening, and I have heard everything. As she wrote, the world of Westwood faded. She wasn't a victim of cyberbullying or a misunderstood student. She was the author. She realized that Mr. Sterling didn't hate her writing. He was intimidated by it. He couldn't understand a girl who lived so deeply inside her own head. It was on that bridge, watching the water swirl around the mossy stones, that the first seed of her grand plan took root. She looked at her phone, at the hateful notifications blinking on the screen, and she felt a strange, cold clarity. If they want a ghost, she whispered to the wind, I will give them a ghost they can never haunt again. She didn't delete the hate page, she didn't reply to the messages. Instead, she turned off her phone and dropped the SIM card into the rushing water below. She decided that day that she would no longer seek the approval of people who were beneath her. She would cut the ties. She would become a shadow to them while building a sun for herself. High school was not an education, it was an endurance test. By the time Claire entered Oak Ridge High, she had perfected the art of being a living void. She had stopped trying to blend in. Instead, she chose to become a background character in her own life. The halls of Oak Ridge were wider, louder, and smelled of expensive perfume, stale sweat, and the electric hum of 1,000 smartphones, each one a potential weapon. The golden ones from elementary school had evolved into the elites. Sarah, now the captain of the debate team and the face of the school's social scene, had refined her cruelty. It wasn't about name-calling anymore, it was about exclusion. Sarah had a way of looking at Claire that made Claire feel like a glitch in a high-definition movie. At the lockers, in the cafeteria, or during gym class, Sarah would lead her group in a game called The Invisible Girl. They would walk directly toward Claire as if she didn't exist, forcing her to flatten herself against the lockers to avoid being trampled. They would have loud, vibrant conversations about weekend parties and summer trips right in front of her, then suddenly stop, look at her for one cold second, and burst into laughter. "Oh, sorry," Sarah would say with a smile that never reached her predatory eyes. "I forgot ghosts don't get invited to beach bonfires. Do you even have a swimsuit, Claire, or do you just wear a shroud?" In her junior year, Claire sat in physics class taught by Mr. Vance. He was a man who valued social intelligence over academic depth. During a group project on velocity, no one chose Claire. She sat at her lab table, her hands folded over her leather journal, while the rest of the class scrambled into laughing, bustling groups. Mr. Vance looked over the rim of his glasses, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Once again, Claire, you find yourself on an island. It's a group project. If you can't find a way to interact with your peers, how do you expect to survive the real world?" "I'm fine working alone, Mr. Vance," Claire whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Efficiency is not the same as leadership, Claire," he snapped, loud enough for the whole class to hear. "But I suppose it's easier to hide in your notebook than to face the challenge of being a person." The class roared. A boy named Marcus threw a crumpled piece of paper that hit Claire in the temple. She didn't flinch. She just picked up the paper, smoothed it out, and saw a crude drawing of a tombstone with her name on it. She looked at Mr. Vance. He saw the paper. He saw her eyes. And then he turned back to the blackboard and began writing equations. The silence of the teacher was the loudest shout of all. That night, the house on Elm Street felt like the only oxygen-rich place on a planet of carbon monoxide. Claire didn't cry. She had run out of tears somewhere between the 8th and 9th grade. Instead, she went to the basement, her father's workshop. Edward was there, his magnifying lamp illuminating a rare edition of Dante's Inferno. He looked up, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of genuine rage in her father's kind eyes. He saw the red mark on her temple from the paper ball. He saw the way she held her journal as if it were a shield. "They are small people, Claire," he said, his voice trembling with a rare, quiet anger. "They live in a world of mirrors, only looking at themselves. But you live in a world of windows. You see the truth. They hate you because your silence is a mirror that shows them how empty they really are." Claire sat on a stool beside him. "They think I'm a ghost, Dad. Mr. Vance said I'm not a person." "Then let them think that," Edward said, handing her a fountain pen, a heavy, silver one with a gold nib. "Let them believe you are nothing, because while they are busy being popular and important in this small town, you are building a universe. Use this pen, write their endings. Give them the roles they deserve in your stories, but never give them the satisfaction of seeing you break." That night, Claire didn't write about her day. She began a new project. She didn't have a name for it yet, but it was a script about a girl who could hear the black box of people's souls, the secret, ugly thoughts they hid behind their smiles. She wrote a scene where a popular girl, who looked remarkably like Sarah, stood in front of a mirror, and instead of her reflection, she saw all the cruel words she had ever spoken, etched into her skin like permanent ink. Claire realized that her journal wasn't just a place to vent, it was a place of judgment. Every time she was bullied, she added a character flaw to the villains in her scripts. She was no longer a victim, she was a judge, a jury, and an executioner, all hidden within the pages of a leather book. She was still alone, yes, she was still an outcast, but for the first time she felt a cold, delicious power. She was the only one who knew how the story would truly end. Senior year at Oak Ridge High was supposed to be a time of last firsts, the last homecoming, the last pep rally, the final countdown to freedom. But for Claire, it was the year the shadows grew teeth. She had survived 10 years of being a ghost, but she was about to learn that even ghosts can be hunted. By now, Claire's isolation was a well-crafted suit of armor. She moved through the corridors with a pair of headphones perpetually around her neck, sometimes playing nothing at all, just to have an excuse not to hear the world. Her leather journals had multiplied. They were her children, her witnesses, her only confidants. She carried the current volume everywhere, tucked under her arm like a vital organ. Sarah and her clique had reached the apex of their social power. They were no longer just bullies, they were the architects of reputation. And they had decided that before graduation, they needed to break Claire's silence once and for all. They didn't want to just ignore her anymore. They wanted to see what was inside the freak's book. It happened during the senior charity gala preparations. For the first time in years, Sarah approached Claire without a smirk. She looked tired, almost human. "Claire," Sarah said, her voice soft, projecting a masterful imitation of sincerity. "Look, we're all graduating in 3 months. I know I've been a lot, but I'm trying to do better. We need someone with a real eye for detail to help with the script for the senior video. Everyone knows you're always writing. Would you consider letting us see some of your work just to give us a theme?" For a split second, the 7-year-old Claire, the one who still craved a seat at the table, woke up. Against every instinct she had honed, Claire felt a tiny spark of hope. That evening, she left her journal on her desk in the library for 5 minutes to grab a reference book Sarah had asked her to check. 5 minutes, that was all it took for the fortress to fall. The next morning, the sanctuary was obliterated. When Claire walked into the senior lounge, the air was different. It wasn't the usual hum, it was a roar of laughter, sharp, jagged, and triumphant. At the center of the room, Marcus was standing on a chair, holding Claire's leather journal high in the air like a trophy. Sarah stood beside him, her face twisted in a mask of mock horror and delight. "Listen to this one," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing off the lockers. "The Queen of Mirrors sits on a throne of glass, unaware that her reflection is rotting. Geez, Claire, you really are a psycho, aren't you? Who is the Queen of Mirrors? Is it Sarah? Or maybe you're just projecting your own loneliness onto us." He began to read her most private thoughts, her descriptions of her teacher's failures, her rawest poems about her father's workshop, her secret scripts where she imagined a life of power. Each word read aloud felt like a layer of skin being peeled back. The room was a sea of filming smartphones. The digital shadow had become a tidal wave. Claire stood in the doorway, her limbs feeling like they were made of lead. She didn't run, she didn't cry. Something inside her, the last thread connecting her to Oak Ridge, simply snapped. She walked toward Marcus. The room went quiet, sensing a climax. She didn't grab for the book, she just looked at Sarah. "You think you've exposed me," Claire said, her voice louder and steadier than anyone had ever heard it. It wasn't the voice of a ghost, it was the voice of a judge. "But all you've done is show everyone that you have nothing of your own to say. You had to steal my soul just to have a conversation." She reached out, took her journal from Marcus's stunned hand, and walked out. But as she hit the double doors of the school, she didn't head to her next class. She walked straight to the parking lot, got into her old, beat-up car, and drove. That afternoon, Claire sat in her father's study. The silence of the house was a healing balm. Edward and Alina found her there, surrounded by her journals. She wasn't crying, she was packing. "I'm done, Dad," she said, her eyes burning with a cold, fierce light. "I'm not going back for graduation. I'm not taking the exams in that building. I'm cutting every single string." Her parents didn't argue. They didn't tell her to tough it out. They saw the invisible bruises had finally become too deep. "Then we leave," Alina said, her voice a solid wall of support. "You've spent 18 years in their story, Claire. It's time you started writing your own, where they don't even get a footnote." That night, Claire performed her final ritual. She didn't just rip a page. She took every contact in her phone, every social media friend from Oak Ridge, and she hit block. One by one, block, block, block. She watched the names disappear into the digital abyss. She wasn't just hiding, she was erasing them from her existence. She was 18, she was broken by the world's standards, but as she looked at the silver fountain pen on her desk, she knew. The ghost was gone, the writer was born. The silence that followed Claire's departure from Oak Ridge High wasn't empty. It was heavy, deliberate, and thick with the scent of old paper and ink. For 2 years, the outside world ceased to exist for her. She didn't just stay home. She went into a self-imposed exile, transforming her bedroom into a laboratory of the soul. Her room became a fortress. She reorganized it until it no longer resembled the girl who had been bullied at St. Jude. She painted the walls a deep, midnight indigo, a color that absorbed the morning light and held it close. She replaced her thin curtains with heavy velvet drapes that muffled the sounds of the neighborhood dogs and the passing cars. Every morning Claire woke up at 5:00 a.m. long before the sun dared to touch the horizon. There was a sacredness to the darkness. In the dark, she wasn't Claire the victim or Claire the ghost. She was a mind without a body. She would sit at her mahogany desk, a gift from Edward, and listen to the steam rising from her mug of jasmine tea. The sound was a soft, rhythmic hiss, a white noise that cleared the static of the past. She began to study, not the textbooks from Mr. Vance's class or the shallow essays of Mr. Sterling, but the masters of human emotion. She read Chekhov, Ibsen, and the dusty, handwritten journals her father brought home from his workshop. She studied the architecture of a scene, how a single look could hold more weight than 1,000 words, and how silence, if used correctly, could be the loudest character in a play. Eleanor and Edward were the silent sentinels of her recovery. They never pushed her to get a job or go to college. They understood that Claire was undergoing a metamorphosis, a process that required the absolute absence of outside pressure. Eleanor would leave trays of food outside Claire's door, warm soups, crusty bread, and apples sliced with surgical precision. She never knocked, she simply left the nourishment as an offering to the work being done inside. Sometimes she would hear the frantic scratching of a fountain pen or the rhythmic clicking of a typewriter, and she would smile. Her daughter was breathing again. Edward, on the other hand, was her intellectual anchor. Twice a week they would have the late-night sessions in the garden. Under the silver glow of the moon, they would sit in wooden Adirondack chairs, the smell of damp earth and blooming jasmine surrounding them. "I finished the third act of The Glass Mirror," Claire whispered during one of these nights, her voice now possessing a resonance it never had in school. "And?" Edward asked, his eyes reflecting the stars. "I made the queen realize that her throne was made of ice," Claire replied. She didn't get defeated by a hero. She melted because she finally felt the heat of her own lies. Edward nodded, a slow, profound movement. "That's the secret, Claire. You don't have to kill your monsters. You just have to make them understand who they are. That is true power." It was during the second year of her exile that the idea for the channel began to flicker, but it wasn't about fame. It was about reclamation. She started by creating a digital wall between her and the world. She bought a high-end microphone with her savings and a camera that she modified to keep her face in deep shadow. She didn't want to be seen, she wanted to be heard. She spent months perfecting her voice. She practiced breathing exercises to steady the tremors that still haunted her throat when she thought of Sarah or Mrs. Gable. She began to record her scripts not as stories but as experiences. She used binaural sounds, the sound of a pen scratching on parchment, the distant thunder of a storm, the ticking of a grandfather clock. She called the project The Script of Silence. It was a name that held all her pain and all her hope. In her mind, she wasn't building a YouTube channel. She was building a megaphone that would eventually scream the truths she had been forced to swallow for 18 years. But for now, it was a secret, a flickering light in a midnight room. She was waiting, she was refining, she was becoming the person who could handle the fire she was about to light. The transition from silent writing to spoken word was the hardest bridge Claire had ever had to cross. For years, her voice had been a prisoner, locked behind a wall of fear and the echoes of Mrs. Gable's mocking tone. Now, in the dead of a Tuesday winter night, with the frost etching crystalline patterns on her window, Claire sat before the glowing red light of the microphone. It looked like a tiny, unblinking eye waiting for her to fail. The setup was humble but intentional. She had draped heavy acoustic foam over her closet doors to create a void of sound. She wanted the recording to be so clear that the listener could hear the very air moving in her lungs, but as she reached for the record button, her hand trembled. Suddenly, she wasn't 20 years old in her safe indigo room. She was 10, standing in the middle of the cafeteria with milk soaking into her socks, listening to the roar of laughter. Her throat closed up. The clump in her neck felt like a physical stone. She tried to say the first word of her script, welcome, but it came out as a strangled, pathetic wheeze. She pushed back from the desk, her breath coming in shallow, frantic gasps. They were right, a dark voice whispered in the back of her mind. You are a ghost. Ghosts don't have voices. You're just a girl in a dark room playing pretend. A soft knock echoed through the door. It wasn't the demanding knock of a teacher or the mocking rap of a bully. It was rhythmic and light. Eleanor didn't wait for an answer. She entered carrying a small ceramic bowl of steaming water infused with eucalyptus and lemon. She didn't look at the recording equipment with confusion or judgment. She walked over to Claire and placed her warm hands on her daughter's trembling shoulders. The first word is always the heaviest, Claire, Eleanor whispered, her voice a steadying force in the swirling storm of Claire's anxiety. Because it has to carry the weight of all the years you stayed silent. Don't try to speak to the world. The world is too big and too cruel. Just speak to me. Speak to the girl you were 10 years ago. Tell her the story she needed to hear when she was hiding under that library table. Eleanor set the bowl down, kissed the top of Claire's head, and slipped out as quietly as a shadow. The scent of eucalyptus cleared the phantom smell of floor wax from Claire's senses. She closed her eyes. She didn't think about YouTube or subscribers or the golden ones. She thought about the little girl with the scuffed shoes. Claire pressed record. The red light glowed. "Welcome," she began. Her voice was low, hushed, but it carried a strange, electric resonance. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of a survivor calling out from the wreckage. This is a place for the unheard. This is a place where the whispers become the story. She began to read the script she had titled The Anatomy of a Whisper. She described the feeling of being invisible in a crowded room. She described the way a teacher's frown could feel like a physical blow. But then she shifted the narrative. She spoke about the power of the observer, how the people who don't talk are the ones who see the truth. As she spoke, the fear began to melt. The words flowed out of her like a river that had been dammed for a century. She found that she could control the texture of her voice, making it as sharp as a needle or as soft as velvet. She was no longer Claire. She was the narrator. She was the architect of the atmosphere. She spent the next 18 hours editing. This was where her meticulous nature, born from years of solitary observation, became her greatest strength. She didn't just cut the audio, she sculpted it. She added the sound of a distant, lonely piano, just 3 notes repeated like a heartbeat. She layered in the sound of wind whistling through a keyhole. She spent 4 hours perfecting the silence between her sentences. She learned that a 3-second pause could create more tension than 100 shouted words. When she finally exported the file, she didn't upload it immediately. She stared at the file name, Episode 01, The Ghost Who Spoke, MP3. She walked to her window and pulled back the heavy velvet drapes. The sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. For the first time in her life, Claire didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like a storm that was gathering its strength, miles out at sea, silent and unnoticed, but inevitable. The act of uploading was not the cinematic explosion Claire had imagined in her rare moments of fantasy. It was a cold, clinical click of a mouse. As the progress bar crawled from 1% to 100%, Claire felt a nauseating mixture of liberation and exposure. She was throwing a message in a bottle into an ocean of billions, and the fear that it would simply sink to the bottom was paralyzing. For the first 3 months, the ocean was silent. Claire would refresh the page, her heart hammering against her ribs, only to see the same number staring back at her, 0 views. It was a different kind of bullying, the bullying of indifference. In school, she had been hated. Here, she was simply non-existent. The silence of the internet felt like a vast digital desert. She would sit in her indigo room, the red light of the microphone now feeling like a mocking eye. "Maybe Mr. Sterling was right," she whispered to the empty room one rainy Tuesday. "Maybe I have nothing to say that anyone wants to hear." But then she remembered Edward's words about the restoration of the soul. She didn't stop. She decided that even if her audience was a ghost, she would perform for that ghost with the intensity of a Shakespearean actor. She uploaded Episode 2, The Architecture of a Sneer, then Episode 3, The Physics of the Back Row. She spent hundreds of hours in the edit suite of her mind. She began to experiment with her voice even further, learning how to drop her pitch to a gravelly whisper when describing a villain, and how to make it light and airy when describing a moment of hope. She was becoming a voice-acting chameleon, all while her face remained hidden in the shadows of her logo, a simple, elegant inkwell with a single white feather. It happened on a Thursday in November. Claire was sitting in the kitchen with Eleanor, the smell of baking bread filling the air. Her phone buzzed, a notification from the YouTube Studio app. "Someone commented on your video," it said. Claire's hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone. She retreated to the hallway, away from the warmth of the kitchen, into the shadows where she felt most at home. She opened the app. The comment was from a user named Lost in the Halls 99. It read, "I thought I was the only one who felt the vacuum when the popular kids stopped talking. I've listened to your first episode 4 times today. Your voice, it feels like a hand reaching out in the dark. Please don't stop." Claire sank to the floor, her back against the cool plaster wall. A single tear, not of pain but of recognition, traveled down her cheek. She wasn't shouting into a void anymore. Someone somewhere had heard her whisper. The growth wasn't a vertical line, it was a slow, steady burn. Lost in the Halls 99 shared the video on a forum for writers. A small blogger wrote a piece about the mystery narrator of Elm Street. The numbers began to shift. 100 views, 500 views, 1,000 views. Suddenly, the comment section wasn't just one person, it was a choir of the misunderstood. People from across the globe, London, Tokyo, New York, were sharing their stories of being bullied, of being the ghosts in their own lives. They called themselves the Silence. Claire became their secret leader. She would spend her nights responding to comments with the same care she gave her scripts. She didn't give generic advice, she gave them words of power. One night, emboldened by the growing community, Claire wrote something dangerous. She wrote a script titled "The Day I Stopped Disappearing." It wasn't just a story, it was a manifesto. She spoke about the moment she decided to block everyone from Oak Ridge High. Isolation, her voice echoed through the headphones of 10,000 listeners, is not a prison unless you let them hold the key. It is a fortress. It is the place where you sharpen your mind until it becomes a blade. The video exploded. In 48 hours, the view count hit 100,000. The algorithm had finally caught the scent of her authenticity. But with the fame came the first shiver of a new fear. What if they found her? What if the Golden Ones saw that the ghost they had chased away was now the one everyone was listening to? Claire looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her monitor. She was still the girl with the hidden face, but her eyes were different now. They weren't looking for a place to hide, they were looking for a way to lead. The winter of Claire's 21st year was the coldest on record, but inside the house on Elm Street, a different kind of heat was building. The script of silence was no longer a hobby, it was a phenomenon. But for the residents of her small town, Claire was still just the girl who didn't finish school, a shadow that occasionally emerged to buy groceries with her head tucked low. This duality, being a queen in the digital realm and a ghost in the physical one, began to pull at the seams of her sanity. Claire spent her days in a state of hyper-observation. She would go to the local coffee shop, wearing an oversized hoodie and glasses that hid her eyes, and sit in the corner. She would watch people. She watched the way a businessman tapped his ring against the table when he was lying on the phone. She watched the way a tired mother looked at her child with a mix of exhaustion and desperate love. She took these stolen moments and wove them into her scripts. Her audience, now reaching 500,000, marveled at her unfiltered honesty. They didn't know that she was a spy in the house of life, recording the world because she was too afraid to join it. It happened on a Tuesday at 3:14 a.m. Claire was in her edit suite, the glow of 2 monitors illuminating her face in hues of blue and violet. Her inbox, usually filled with fan letters and spam, pinged with a notification that looked different. The subject line was simple: regarding the anatomy of a whisper, potential adaptation. The sender wasn't a username like Lost in the Halls 99. It was from a domain that made Claire's heart stop, at apexstudios.com. Apex Studios was a titan in the industry, the house that produced the kind of prestige dramas that won Oscars and changed cultures. Claire's breath hitched. She clicked the email with a finger that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Dear creator of the script of silence, my name is Marcus Vane, not to be confused with the boy from her school, a different Marcus, a senior development executive at Apex. For the past month, our writer's room has been obsessed with your storytelling. There is a raw, cinematic quality to your scripts that we haven't seen in a decade. We are currently looking for a fresh, authentic voice to develop a limited series centered around the psychology of the outcast. We would like to hop on a Zoom call to discuss purchasing the rights to your scripts and potentially bringing you on as a head writer. Please let us know when you are available to step out of the shadows. Step out of the shadows. The phrase hit Claire like a physical blow. Success wasn't just a number on a screen anymore, it was an invitation to be seen. She felt a wave of nausea. To work for Apex meant meetings, it meant people looking at her. It meant the possibility of being recognized as the freak of Oak Ridge. She looked at her reflection in the darkened monitor. She saw the girl who used to count cracks in the pavement. Could that girl lead a writer's room in Los Angeles? She didn't sleep. At 6:00 a.m. she went down to the kitchen. Edward was already there, grinding coffee beans, the smell of roasted hazelnut filling the air. He looked at his daughter and knew immediately that the gathering storm had finally reached their shore. "They found you, didn't they?" he asked, his voice steady and calm. Claire handed him her phone. He read the email slowly, his spectacles perched on the tip of his nose. When he finished, he didn't cheer. He didn't jump for joy. He walked over and gripped Claire's hands. "The fortress was built to protect you while you were healing, Claire," Edward said, his eyes searching hers. "But a fortress can become a prison if you stay too long. This isn't just a job offer. It's the universe asking if you're ready to forgive yourself for what those children did to you." "I'm scared, Dad," she whispered. "What if they see me and the magic disappears? What if I'm just me?" "Then just you is the person who wrote those words," he replied. "And those words are currently shaking the foundations of a studio in California. You aren't stepping out of the shadows, Claire. You are bringing the shadows with you. That's your power." The reply, with Eleanor watching from the doorway, her eyes shimmering with pride. Claire sat at the kitchen table. She didn't go back to her indigo room. She did it right there in the light of the morning sun. She typed, "Dear Mr. Vane, I am interested. However, I have certain conditions regarding my anonymity during the initial stages. I am ready to talk." She hit send. The sound of the whoosh as the email departed felt like the sound of a cage door opening. The first chapter of her life, the chapter of the paper fortress, was reaching its final, thunderous pages. Before the Zoom call, before the contract, and before the flight to Los Angeles, there was the wait. For Claire, waiting was a familiar ghost. She had spent years waiting for the school day to end, waiting for the bullying to stop, and waiting for her life to begin. But this wait, the silence after hitting send, was different. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, wondering if the wind would lift her up or let her fall. To distract herself from the blinking cursor on her screen, Claire retreated into the attic of her mind. She remembered a day when she was 5 years old, long before St. Jude's had tried to dim her spirit. She had been sitting under the massive oak tree in their backyard, scribbling on the back of a grocery receipt with a broken crayon. Her mother, Eleanor, had found her there, tears streaming down Claire's tiny face. "What's wrong, my little bird?" Eleanor had asked, kneeling in the grass. "The bird in my head," Claire had sobbed, pointing to her temple. "He can't find his way home. He's lost in the clouds, and the clouds are made of gray wool." Eleanor hadn't laughed. She hadn't called it childish imagination. She had taken the receipt and looked at the jagged lines. She saw that Claire wasn't just drawing. She was trying to map an emotion. "Then you must give him a map, Claire," Eleanor said, her voice a soothing melody. "Write the words, tell the clouds to part. Your mind is the weather and you are the sun. Never let the gray wool win." That was the moment the paper fortress was born. Her parents had been the first ones to validate that her inner world was more real than the outer one. Without their radical belief in her weirdness, Claire knew she would have been crushed by Mrs. Gable years ago. Back in her indigo room, the wait continued. Claire became hyper-aware of her surroundings. She noticed the way the dust motes danced in the blue light of her monitor, tiny, silent performers in a private theater. She noticed the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs, each second feeling like a hammer blow against her resolve. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. Her hand, though trembling, moved with a mind of its own. She didn't write a script. She wrote a letter to the girl she used to be. "Dear girl in the back row," she wrote, the ink bleeding slightly into the grain of the paper. "They think they won because they made you quiet. They think they broke you because you stopped looking them in the eye, but you were just gathering ink. You were just waiting for the right moment to overflow. The paper didn't rip you, it held you together. Soon, the world will know your name, but more importantly, they will know your silence." As the hours turned into days without a reply, Claire's body began to rebel. Her old habits returned, the way she would pick at the skin around her nails until they bled, the way her leg would jive nervously under the table. She went for a walk at 2:00 a.m., the cold night air biting at her lungs. She passed by Oak Ridge High. In the moonlight, the school looked like an ancient, crumbling ruin rather than a place of education. She stood at the iron gates, looking at the dark windows. "I survived you," she whispered, her breath blooming in a white cloud. "You are a tomb, and I am the one who walked out." The realization hit her then. She didn't need Apex Studios to be a writer. She was already a writer. The contract was just a mirror. If they didn't reply, she would still be Claire. She would still have her voice. The paper fortress was no longer a place she hid in. It was a place she commanded. And then her phone vibrated in her pocket. Not a ping, but a long, persistent hum. A call from a California area code. The phone in Claire's pocket felt like a live wire, vibrating against her leg with a persistence that demanded an answer. A California area code. The numbers 310 looked alien, shimmering on her screen in the middle of the quiet night of Oak Ridge. She stood there, just outside the iron gates of her old school, a girl caught between her past and a future she was terrified to touch. She swiped to answer. Her thumb felt numb. "Hello," she whispered. Her voice sounded small against the vast, cold emptiness of the school parking lot. Is this the creator of the script of silence? The voice on the other end was bright, fast-paced, and filled with a kind of restless energy Claire had never encountered. It was Marcus Vane. This is Marcus from Apex. I know it's late there or early, I can never remember the time zones, but I couldn't wait until the scheduled Zoom. I just finished reading your latest upload, The Anatomy of a Whisper, and I have to tell you, I haven't slept in 6 hours because of it. Claire leaned her back against the cold iron bars of the gate. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she expected to hear Sarah's laughter or Mrs. Gable's scolding, but there was only the sound of Marcus's genuine excitement. I'm glad you liked it, she managed to say. Her voice was gaining a bit of its studio resonance strength. Liked it, Claire? I can call you Claire, right? We don't just like it. We think you've tapped into something primal. The industry is full of people trying to imagine what it's like to be an outsider. But you are the outsider. You write with the precision of someone who has spent a lifetime observing from the cracks in the wall. For the first time in her life, someone was praising her for the very thing that had made her a target. Her weirdness, her silence, her shadow dwelling, it wasn't a defect here. It was her greatest asset, it was her currency. We want to fly you out, Marcus continued, his words tripping over each other. First class, to Los Angeles. We want you in the room. We have a director, someone you definitely know, someone who specializes in dark, intimate dramas, who is dying to meet the person behind the voice. He thinks you're a genius, Claire, and honestly, I'm starting to think he's right. Genius, the word felt heavy, like a crown she wasn't sure her head could support. I have conditions, Claire said, her voice turning sharp and professional, a defense mechanism she had practiced in her head 1,000 times. I don't do publicity, no face reveals yet, no interviews. I want to be the writer, just the writer. There was a pause on the other end. Claire held her breath. Was this where they would say she was too difficult? Was this where the dream would shatter? Claire, Marcus said, his tone softening. In Hollywood, mystery is the best kind of marketing. If you want to be the ghost of Apex, we'll build you a castle. We don't care about your face. We care about your brain. We care about the way you make us feel like we're 10 years old again, hiding in the back of a classroom. As she hung up the phone, Claire felt as if the ground beneath her had shifted. She looked up at the windows of Oak Ridge High. They were dark and empty. For 10 years, those windows had been her prison bars. Now they were just glass. She began to walk home, but her gait was different. Her head wasn't tucked into her chest. She wasn't counting the cracks in the sidewalk. She was looking at the stars. When she entered the house, she found Edward and Alina sitting at the kitchen table. They hadn't gone to bed. They had been waiting for the verdict of the phone call. A single candle flickered between them, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. They want me, Claire said, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and triumph. They want to fly me to L.A. They called me a genius. Alina stood up and wrapped her daughter in a hug that smelled of jasmine and home. We always knew, Claire, she whispered into her hair. The world just finally caught up to you. Edward reached into the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of sparkling cider they had been saving for a special occasion that had never seemed to come. He popped the cork, a soft pop that sounded like a starting pistol. To the girl who stopped being a ghost, Edward said, raising his glass, and started being the one who tells the ghosts what to do. That night, as Claire began to pack her first suitcase, she found her old, scuffed shoes from St. Jude's, the ones she had kept as a reminder of her pain. She looked at them for a long time. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she walked to the trash bin in her indigo room and dropped them in. The first chapter of her life, the one where she was a victim, was officially over. The paper fortress was being dismantled brick by brick to make room for something much, much bigger.